A silhouette prowls, unseen by the moonlit sky. Night has just begun. The girl found herself in front of a small oak door. She stopped, suddenly coherent of her surroundings. Everything around her was white, like a smoky void that stretched past the edge of her sight. It felt strange to walk around it. The ground was also white, solid, but inexplicably felt as though she would fall right through it. She stared at the door again, fighting against a ball of panic that grew in her stomach. The door didn't have a wall attached to it, seemingly floating in place. She couldn't remember coming here, or why she had come, much less where here actually was. Has she been kidnapped? No, she thought to herself as she steadied her breathing. She wasn't sure why, but she did not feel like she was in any danger here. But someone has a lot of explaining to do.
It has been a long time since I've had visitors to my shop.
The girl froze. The voice, impossibly, came from the other side of the floating door. It spoke slowly, deliberately, as if preciously weighing the significance of every single syllable.
We're open. Come on in,
the deep voice continued.
I've just finished brewing some tea, if you would like some.
Whoever he was, he sounded incredibly bored. She opened the door slowly, ready to act if anything felt amiss. The girl let out a small gasp of awe as she looked at the other side of the door. Taking the first few steps inside, she spun around to take everything in, hardly noticing the door vanishing behind her. The walls of the shop were lined with books, scrolls, records, and anything else that could be read on paper. Dimly, the sconces lit up the endless covers of literature with their brave little flame. And in front of her stood the man with the deep voice, a gaunt figure with simple gray robes and a silver mask that reminded her of ones she saw at banquets at home. While the masquerade mask hid the man's entire face, it did nothing to hide his curving horns or his long white hair that curled down his hunched back.
For someone so young as yourself,
the masked man said before the girl could speak.
We can only wonder what the gods are thinking, I suppose.
He sat comfortably behind his counter, idly mixing away at a small clay cup with his spidery fingers.
Drink before it gets cold. I will explain.
The girl sat down without a word, silently masking her frustration as she did so. Gingerly, the man handed her a clay cup identical to his own. It smelled like no other tea she had ever drank in her life. She took a sip and paused. The fact that it was so delicious frustrated her even more.
I'm sure you have many questions, so I will try and answer them the best I can,
the masked man continued after she had finished taking her sip.
This is the All-Seer's Emporium. This is a place wholly separated from your reality, only visible to those who have their fates entangled with divinity itself.
She didn't say a word, and kept her eyes glued to the man who, she assumed, was the All-Seer. He seemed to appreciate her patience, then continued.
Make no mistake, you are not lost. The Emporium only reveals itself to those which need it, and with it, the All-Seer to reveal the path yet to come, and bestow to them their blessings.
He let those last words hang, then quickly added,
The All-Seer would be me.
The girl remained silent.
I had assumed there would be more questions. The ones before you had many.
The All-Seer gazed quietly behind his silver mask.
Or perhaps you do not trust my words.
He leaned back in his creaking chair.
I do not think the fates brought you here by accident, child.
While you may
stay silent, the fire in those eyes betrays you. Firm, resolute, the willful eyes of one that wishes to see justice in their world. Or perhaps the tea was not to your liking.
No, the girl said. The tea is delicious. Thank you. She dropped her gaze, but quickly recovered. You're going to help me. Dropping his cup to his counter, the All-Seer tilted his head. As composed as the girl was, there was no hiding the edge of desperation in her voice. She kept her hood up, sitting facing slightly away from him, as if she wanted nothing to do with him or the world around her. But despite all this, the man felt that she was pushing herself to trust him with great strain. He stood slowly from his chair and nodded to the girl with magenta eyes. She was not the first to call for his aid, nor would she be the last.
Wait here.
He suddenly turned around, walking down a dark hall behind him that the girl seemed to notice for the first time.
I will return shortly.
The All-Seer assured, before the girl could protest. He had already disappeared down the hallway. Frowning, the girl got to her chair to briefly consider following the masked man, but ultimately decided against it. For the time being, he seemed to be an ally. Probably better to play along for now, she thought, approaching the things that caught her eye near the bookshelves. Alongside the tomes and other books was a shelf entirely filled with glass-like spheres, which were held down by a small gray disc on the bottom to likely prevent them from rolling off the shelves. These orbs on the shelves were all very distinct from one another. Some shone with brilliant radiance, while others were dull, almost colorless. There were also several discs that didn't have any orbs in them, or at least, that's what she first thought. Looking closer, she noticed small shards of the orb around the base of these discs, barely visible unless one had good eyesight, which in fact, she did. The girl also noticed that each of these discs had a small label on them, written in a gold feathery cursive. Names that almost all of which she did not recognize, and most of which were written in a language she couldn't even read or recognize in the slightest. Then, standing on her toes, she reached for the one orb with a name she did recognize.
Without any disrespect, those are more for looking,
the All-Seer said from behind her,
rather than touching.
Her vision began to slow as she could do nothing but watch as the orb slipped from her hand and hurtled towards the floor. She quickly closed her eyes, anticipating the shatter of glass behind her. But nothing happened. As she opened her eyes, The orb she had lost her grip on had fell about 5 inches from the ground, then stopped entirely, lazily floating in place. It then jumped from its position near the girl's feet, making an arc in the air until it skidded to a stop in the old man's left hand. Wide-eyed, she stared, without a word, at both the orb and the man holding it.
Perhaps I should keep them behind glass.
The All-Seer seemed to mumble to himself. He set down a small orange pouch that he was holding, gently placing it on the counter he had sat at. Then, with that same hand, he swiftly waved it sideways and snapped his fingers. The sphere in his other hand then vanished.
Shall we continue?
He said, as he sat back down on his creaking chair. That was magic. Real magic. The girl almost spoke in a whisper. I was always told there was no magic left in the world, but since the rot... She paused, then turned around. The shelf behind her now had a layer of glass protecting the orbs inside, including the orb she had wanted to see. Who are you, really? She asked.
The All-Seer,
he replied simply, as if that answered her question. That's not what I mean, and you know it, she hissed. Those horns you have. Do the other kingdoms know that there's a mage in the Goat Clan? Are there others? Maybe there's something that could be...
Goat Clan?
He seemed a bit taken aback.
I'm afraid magic is not enough to stop what is happening in your world. He spoke solemnly. At least, not anymore. This will not be something resolved so easily, if at all.
Then why did you bring me here? She didn't bother hiding her frustration anymore. What's the point?
Like I said before, the Emporium only appears to those who need it.
He motioned over to the other chair.
It would seem you do. I decide nothing. I only reveal to you the paths. Now come. Take a seat.
Finally, the girl decided to return to the counter. During this time, the All-Seer had taken the time to carefully unwrap the orange pouch he had placed there earlier. Some black cards and a silver bracelet were among the things he had removed from his bag. By the looks of it, there still seemed to be more inside the orange pouch, but the man left its contents unseen to her. She finally met the man's gaze. He held out the bracelet in his fingers, hearing its links quietly ring their chime as the man dropped the chain into her palm.
I believe this might be of use to you.
He seemed lost in thought.
It has a name, you see. The Litura. This bracelet was a gift to Minerva, the goddess of wisdom, during the great era of the Flame-Bringers. It is yours now. Do put it on.
The bracelet itself shone in a white silver sheen, yet had the unmistakable tint of blue to it. As she slipped it on, she was surprised to see that the bracelet seemed to fit her almost too well. It was also remarkably comfortable to wear, as if she could hardly feel it on her wrist at all.
Hear me well, and remember these words. No matter the path you choose, there will surely be those that wish to bring harm to you and those you care about. The All-Seer began, sighing deeply. This artifact will let you know when such dangers are nearby, growing cold to the touch.
Once again, the masked man let his words hang in the air.
As the danger approaches, or perhaps you approach it, the bracelet will feel dreadfully frigid, as if the wrath of winter roars through your arm. You may find that it may not always be in your best interest to act on the bracelet's warning, and instead rely on diplomacy or the element of surprise. Now, I do not think I have to say this, but I will. It is much easier to be surrounded by allies rather than the opposite. Would you not agree?
Standing up, the girl waved her bracelet arm around her. After a few moments of this, she had a peculiar look on her face as she returned to her seat. It's supposed to get cold.
Only around those who wish to harm you.
Okay, then. Thank you, the girl said, managing a small smile. Truly, it had been quite some time since the All-Seer had spoken to anyone other than himself, but he was now feeling doubt in his ability to properly talk to others. Furthermore, he wasn't too sure, but there was a nagging feeling that something was wrong.
Would you allow me to read your fortune?
He quickly changed the subject.
You may decline, if you so choose.
The girl watched the man take the deck of black cards from the countertop and began to shuffle them. He seemed like he was going to, regardless of what she said, so she simply nodded. Enthusiastically, the man tossed the deck of cards into the air with a flick of his wrist, and she watched as the cards spun in the air as they flew, but then refused to come back down. Instead, like snow in a blizzard, they individually fluttered and flew in a small whirlwind above the table, as the two of them could do nothing but watch. Despite the movement above, she never saw two cards collide. There was no predictability or rhythm to the shuffling. It simply worked itself out despite all the madness above. And, as abruptly as it began, one by one, the cards began to fall slowly to the table, like the flower petals of this blossom spring, until all of them were eventually face down in a ring shape on the countertop. Once the cards finally lay still, the All-Seer broke the silence.
I have laid the cards on the table for your past. Draw one, he said, subtly shifting himself forward in the seat. The past, the present, and the future. The passage of time is inevitable. Let us see where all of this began.
The cards had been laid out in front of her as he had said, perfectly laid out with not one out of place. She had seen other fortune tellers do this in the back streets of her hometown too, but none of them could do what this man had. Can't hurt, I suppose, she thought to herself as she picked up a card. Then she gasped, pulling her hand back. What surprised her was that the card seemed to take on color at her touch.
The King of Diamonds, murmured the All-Seer. But it is reversed.
What does that mean? She looked back at the card.
This card usually symbolizes a man of authority, someone of wealth and influence. While reversed, however, it takes on a different meaning. The wealth has been turned to greed, their ambition soured to deceit and lies. He noticed the girl's reaction to this statement. I sensed that things were not always this way, but something or someone has affected them greatly so, and judging by the look on your face, you seem to know exactly who I am referring to.
She didn't say anything, only nodded.
Well, perhaps the next card will be of more use to you.
He put a hand on the table, and the King of Diamonds faded to black.
Please.
She scanned the table once more, then decided on a card to the left of her. As she drew the card, this one did not change to her relief. She turned it over to see
the 7 of Spades. Interesting. It symbolizes certainty, the absolute truth. How you may have been feeling about your current circumstances, know that your judgment has been correct. Purge any doubts you may have had about yourself. Others may try to convince you otherwise, but you know the truth,
concluded the All-Seer, a new uneasiness clear in his voice.
Do you wish to see a glimpse of the future, child? It is not my position to refuse you, but I must warn you that it has had lasting consequences on those who cannot handle it. What is your answer?
Show me. The girl did not hesitate at all. The masked man exhaled softly as he put his hand on the table once more, as the card faded again. She took the card closest to her, flinching as it changed at her touch.
Your card of the future is the 3 of Clubs, also reversed. Normally, this card would symbolize the dawn of change, a second chance, if you will, after removing all doubt from oneself to make their desires a reality. When reversed, it symbolizes urgency, so much so that one ends up overlooking the present. Simply put, it is to lose sight of what was already right in front of oneself.
The All-Seer put his hand to the table, and the cards disappeared as if they were never there at all.
I'm sorry. These are not the cards I had expected, he said softly. But the cards do not lie, I'm afraid.
A deceitful man, a truth that I know, and a premature decision. The girl frowned. That's my past, present, and future, huh? She seemed more perplexed than upset by the fortune reading.
I can only hope that I have helped you in some way.
The All-Seer clapped his hands together. She was strong. Perhaps there was hope after all.
But unfortunately, we seem to be all out of time.
What does that mean? She began to say, but there was a dull ringing in her head, and she started to lose her balance as she stood up out of her chair. Grabbing the side of the countertop was all she could do to prevent herself from doubling over. What did you do to me? Was all she could say before the dizziness overtook her.
Mortals cannot stay here for too long.
The All-Seer sounded like he was getting further and further away with each word.
Such is the nature of the All-Seer's Emporium.
Her eyes struggled to stay open as she felt all her strength being sapped from her body. She was now slumped on the table, half her face plastered on the wood, while her vision narrowed on the thing on the table beside her. Words wouldn't come out of the girl's mouth. She tried to move towards the All-Seer, but only shifted slightly down the counter as her arm slapped across the tabletop harmlessly. At this point, she knew that she could move no more. All feeling in her hands and legs had gone, and it was a downhill battle just to simply keep her eyes open.
You will wake up in your chambers as you were before. You will remember all of what we discussed here.
The All-Seer removed her cup and put them in a tray that he had produced.
And you will forget all about me,
he said wistfully, as the girl in front of him started to fade away. It felt as though she was floating out of her body, her consciousness being the only thing that tied her down. She didn't want to let go, but there was very little she could do to fight it as her eyes finally closed shut. Then, there was nothing.
It has been my pleasure to meet you, Chosen.
He said this to himself as the last remnants of her presence flickered away, sent back to her own reality. He placed his own cup into his tray and felt it float past him as he waved it down the dark hallway. It had been nice having company again. For now, he could only hope for the best. The All-Seer diverted his gaze upon the shelf with a new glass cover. Even while hunched over, the masked man's face was just in line of the orb that the girl had almost dropped. He gave it a scrutinizing glance from behind the glass, frowning. The orb had taken on a reddish glow, cracks beginning to form from the inside out. Then, he looked back at the table where the girl had lay moments before. Along with the girl with the bracelet, it would seem that the orange pouch was gone as well. The All-Seer sighed. Hope was all he could ask for.